The Pacific Northwest, just like the rest of the country, is in the midst of an economic boom as jobs become more abundant. But as our country does well economically, we still find ourselves divided more each day on issues like immigration, healthcare, and concerns over the Trump administration. I recently sat down with Congressman Adam Smith to discuss these and more issues. Here's what he had to say. Let's talk first, obviously, about the big thing, the budget. Yeah. This going on. It looks like a week from Monday, if my math is correct, we're going to run out of time again. What do you see a deal getting done? I know you did not support the continuing resolution. Let's talk about that, and let's talk about what needs to be done in the next just a little hair over a week.
Well, I continue to be skeptical that an agreement will be reached. There's a great deal of difference of opinion. There's also been a poor job of negotiation being done. There's greater distance now between the White House, the Senate, and the House in terms of the key leaders actually sitting down and talking than there's ever been during my time in Congress. And you can't get to a conclusion unless the people who need to ultimately support it are in the room. And we got a group here and a group there and a group over there, and nobody's really sort of bringing the key players together and saying, here's what we need to get a budget resolution done to get our appropriations bills passed. And so I'm skeptical that we're going to get there. And the only reason I'm hesitating now is in order to explain this, I have to get really technical. And it's like the old Chevy Chase joke. They said there would be no math. But there are two very important things to explain for people to understand why we're at the impasse we are on the appropriations process. And then the second thing, the second issue I'll bring up, gets into why we're also at an impasse on things like health care and broader issues like that we would like to fix in terms of how our politics is fundamentally broken in this country. But first, I will inflict you with the math. So, in 2011, the Budget Control Act was passed. It placed strict caps on how much money could be spent in the discretionary budget. I will spare you the discretionary mandatory. Discretionary budget's a little over $1 trillion. It's defense and non-defense. So it placed caps on both. And the idea at the time was, well, the Republicans only care about defense. So if we cap defense and we cap non-defense, then all parties concerned have an interest in reaching a solution to our long-term budget picture, and we'll go forward. That never happened. So we've been living with the Budget Control Act since 2011. And this year, the cap for defense is $549 billion for FY18. Non-defense, it's $515 billion. Neither side's happy with those numbers. They are very small numbers. And keep in mind, we're talking about a $21 trillion debt, $700 billion deficit. As I said, it's 549 and 515. And that adds up to, I'd have to go off the top of my head here, a little over $1 trillion. The budget's $4 trillion in terms of what the federal government spends. So what we're arguing over is a fairly small part of the budget. You know, the mandatory programs are much larger. And then, of course, there's taxes and revenue, which is important. So, and I don't think cutting taxes in the face of a $21 trillion debt was a smart move, but it's what the Republicans did. So we were in a situation where it was difficult to get support for discretionary spending because of the debt and the deficit. And then they went and cut revenue by another $2 trillion. That makes it even more difficult. So you've got those two numbers. How do we get it? And those numbers are not acceptable to most of the people in the House and the Senate. So they're trying to negotiate increases in those numbers. Democrats are of the opinion that it's dollar for dollar. You increase defense and you increase non-defense by the same amount. Republicans don't want that. They want to go massively over the defense number, and they really apparently don't care about any of the other funding, even though the rest of the funding, that non-defense number, includes the Department of Homeland Security. It includes the Department of Justice. It includes TSA. It also includes transportation, infrastructure, education, a lot of things that are very important. So, you know, there's this huge impasse on that, on getting over those budget numbers, which brings me to the second and perhaps more important point. Why can't we get agreement on this? Well, the reason we can't get agreement on this is because a consensus has grown up in this country over the course of the last 30 or 35 years that the people want a balanced budget, they don't want taxes raised, and they don't want spending cut. That's impossible. As I always say, they do not give me a magic wand when I am elected to this position. And you ask yourself, well, how did that happen? And you can look at the polling data. It's really amazing. I mean, 80% of the people support a balanced budget. Then you say, okay, well, what do you want to cut? And you list all the areas where we spend money, and they say nothing. And what taxes do you want to raise? Well, nothing. There's further details to that. And this has happened because so many politicians have run for office over the last 30 years promising that. I'm for a balanced budget. Okay, well, you want to increase taxes? Oh, no, we can't increase taxes right now. We need to do tax reform. Well, what about entitlements? I mean, that's 2/3 of the budget. Well, the pledge that we made on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid is one that we must keep. We can reform the system, but yeah, that's what they say because that's what the polls tell them they need to say in order to get votes. So it becomes this vicious cycle. The politicians promise the impossible, the people come to expect it, and they get angry when it's not delivered. Now, all of that's just background. The sentence that you really need to remember to understand why we can't pass an appropriations bill is given that demand for a balanced budget, no tax increases, no significant spending cuts, any appropriations bill that we would vote for is going to be politically unpopular. There is, because it's going to both spend too much money and not spend enough at the same time. So, elected officials are aware of this. They don't want to vote for it because if you vote for it, you're violating some number of those promises that you're going to balance the budget and not cut things. So that has locked us into paralysis. And the only way out, I think, is an honest conversation with the American people. Look, we're not going to balance the budget anytime soon. We got to start moving towards a more fiscally responsible path. Personally, I think that involves raising taxes, not cutting them. But as long as that's going on, getting a budget resolution that enables us to go above the budget caps is difficult because the budget caps, that's a law. 549, 515, that's the law. We have to vote to change it in order to get a budget deal. And frankly, I don't see it happening.
So you're thinking that possibly a week from Monday, we're still not going to have a deal that's going to end up on the president's desk to be signed?
I can guarantee you that a week from Monday we're not going to have a deal. There are all these happy mutterings that, okay, we'll need one more short-term, spending gap thing, but then we'll get there. That's the part that I'm skeptical about. How we're going to get there, how we're going to overcome all of those contradictions that I just laid out.
Let's talk a little bit about DACA. Which is, they're saying, is partially holding the works up here. Is your office, first off, from a local standpoint, is your office getting calls from constituents or people in our area who are concerned that they're going to suddenly be kicked out of the only country they've ever known? One. And two, do you see this being resolved anytime soon, given the president seems pretty stuck on this wall? He said this week, no wall, no DACA. And then he kind of backpedaled a little bit about it a couple of days ago. Where do you see this whole thing going?
Yes, first of all, we do hear from constituents who are in the DACA program or know somebody who is and are worried about how it's going to impact them. This is somewhere between 700 and 800,000 people nationwide who are impacted by this. It's a very real impact, and we hear about it often from a lot of constituents. And we should pass a DACA bill. It's going to be difficult. Now, look, the United States government under President Obama gave these young people legal status in this country. Said if you came into this country under the age of 18 and you've lived here and there's some certain other requirements, you qualify to apply for legal status. And 800,000 people did. And then President Trump took it away. We should give it back, independent of a whole lot of other discussions on immigration policy. Like you said, the president wants to talk about the wall, he wants to talk about family reunification, he wants to talk about how many immigrants. Apparently he wants to talk about trying to convince people from Norway to come into our country. People in Norway got it pretty good. By and large, they're not looking to come here. And I do need to just make one quick comment about that. The president's ignorance on immigration and how important it is to this country is staggering. Yes, a lot of these people come from countries, and I won't use the word he used because it's insulting, let's just say from countries that are struggling. You can't deny that Haiti and these people, they're struggling economically. Or in the case of El Salvador, they're in the midst of violence. Somalia, same thing. But those people come to this country hungry for a better life. They work hard. I mean, I see the immigrants in my community working 2 and 3 jobs. They put 2 and 3 families together in one house. They work 16 hours a day, and that makes our economy better. These are good people. They may come from bad countries, but they're good people, and they're good for our economy. So, trying to go after those other immigration issues, I don't think is appropriate. I think we made a promise. Well, first of all, we should have recognized, as you said, this is the only country they've ever known. If America is to have any sense of the values that the rest of the world used to look up to, we can't just take these people and turn them back when they've got no place to go. We should have done DACA. Congress should have passed legislation. It shouldn't have been left to the president to pass an executive order to do it. Congress should pass legislation. But there are too many anti-immigrant members of Congress in the House. They won't even bring it up for a vote. If it came up for a vote, if you came up with a straight bill that said, under 18, came into the country, not documented, we will now give you a pathway to legal status, it would pass overwhelmingly in the House and the Senate. But the Republicans won't bring it up for a vote because they've got about 150 of their members who are adamantly opposed, I think, to any immigrant. Maybe not Norway, but apparently any immigrant out there. So Paul Ryan won't bring it up for a vote. It could be fixed tomorrow if they just brought it up for a vote. And then the president comes in and he wants his wall and he wants his other anti-immigration stuff. I don't see that happening. So I don't see a resolution. I don't see us agreeing to all the punitive measures against immigrants that he wants to implement. And this whole opposition to family reunification. Family reunification has actually worked to improve the immigrant community. I mean, when immigration started, if it was just job related, you were basically bringing in a lot of young men with no families, and they weren't terribly happy. So if you allowed them to bring in their spouse and their children and their parents, it built stronger communities, and it helped improve our country. And that really, at the end of the day, is the debate here. I believe, and I think most people in this country believe, that immigration has been a positive for this country. President Trump doesn't believe that.
Switching from immigration to, you mentioned briefly these tax cuts. Now, we're 2-3 weeks into this since that whole thing went down in D.C. I know you voted against them. You were against that particular measure. What long-term effect do you see this having on local workers, particularly ones that work over here at Boeing or any of these other companies here in Seattle?
I don't think it's going to have much effect on workers because the bulk of the tax cuts went to the wealthy and corporations. They'll keep the money. Now, one of the biggest things that they're doing, well, let's put it this way. If you're wealthy enough to own a lot of stock, this will be good for you. So, if you're significantly invested in a 401k, but of course, the more money you have, the more you benefit from that. Because corporations will pay more dividends and they'll do more stock buybacks. And a stock buyback is just a fancy way to drive up your share price and make sure that your largest shareholders make a lot of money. There's been all these stories about, this company's giving a bonus because, they got this tax break. Well, if you really look at what they're doing, where their money's going, the bonuses are infinitesimal compared to what they're doing for their stock buyback programs. And some of the other stuff they're doing is investing technology so that they can get rid of more workers and be more efficient. And I know we have to battle that, and that's a challenge with or without the tax break. But look, we've cut taxes in this country on the federal level for 18 years. 16 years. I don't think we needed another tax cut in the face of a $21 trillion debt and a $700 billion deficit when we have never had wealth more concentrated in this country than we do right now. So I think the tax cut was the wrong approach, and I think it's going to make resolving these budget issues in the future even more difficult.
I've just learned that you are going to be doing the Democratic rebuttal to the State of the Union address next week. This weekend, tomorrow, I'm sorry. Tell me a little bit about that.
I don't know a lot about that. I recorded it yesterday. I'm vaguely aware that the president gives a weekly address, and we refer to it not so much as the rebuttal as this is the Democratic message for the week. So I recorded a 5-minute statement that I don't know where it plays. I should figure that out at some point, but I think it plays on the radio and on some TV stations on Saturday. And, basically what I've said to you is what I say in that video, that, Democrats want a solution to these problems, and that the reason that we were opposed to a short-term spending bill is it's not a solution. It doesn't fund the government, and that basically the Republicans have refused to govern on immigration, on health care, on the budget, and we were trying to put pressure on them to at least allow these things to come up for a vote.
Switching to foreign policy now, you are the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Yes. And what is your reaction to the way, particularly tensions in North Korea? We got the Olympics coming up in a couple of weeks here, and they're right there in South Korea. North Korea's, I don't know if this is a show or not, if they're working with the South Koreans to be involved. While the president continues to call their leader names, what's your reaction to the whole way his administration's handling all of this?
The biggest problem with the Trump foreign policy is that it is so insulting. And frankly, that's the biggest problem with the president in general. I never imagined we'd have a president like this. I mean, we can argue about policy. We just had a long discussion about immigration. We can talk about the budget and all of that. But this president is so belittling and so insulting to everybody. It's just the way he talks. Look at his tweets. I mean, if my children were tweeting like that, I'd take away their phone for a month and say, learn how to be respectful of the people you're dealing with. We just heard this morning that the president, I guess, is trying to figure out how to not have Great Britain hate him anymore. So he's decided that maybe retweeting videos, fake videos that are made up by white supremacist groups from England wasn't such a good idea after all. But look, the whole and I'll say it, you can edit it if you want, the whole shithole country comment. This feeds on to a whole series of insults. NATO's not, pulling it. Basically, the whole rest of the world's saying that that's the way you feel about us. We don't want to deal with you. We need friends. We need allies. You can't dominate the world and force it to your will. There are a lot of countries that have power, that have interests, and the president has systematically insulted so many of them. I mean, at the same time he's trying to deal with North Korea, he's talking about unilaterally pulling out of the free trade agreement with South Korea. So a change in tone to show that you actually respect people would be helpful.
Do you see this administration, and particularly his demeanor, of being rather damaging to our relationship with our closest allies, Great Britain, Canada, Mexico, Australia, wherever? Do you see it being damaging?
It's been very damaging. I mean, President Trump is not popular in these places. And look, I've said this before. When your whole message is America first, I mean, look, I'm going to stand up for this country first and foremost. I think that goes without saying. I think every elected representative of every country in the world knows that their first job is to protect their home country and their own citizens, and to do what's best for them. We get that. But when you stand up and say America first, you're basically, telling the rest of the world to go to hell. And that's the way it comes across. So I think it has been very damaging to those alliances. Now, fortunately, Secretary Mattis at the Department of Defense, to some degree Secretary Tillerson, some of our foreign policy people, they show up afterwards and try to clean up the mess and try to maintain those relationships. But as long as the president continues down the path that he's going down, it's going to make everything more difficult.
Let's switch a little to some legislation. There was a press release, I think it was last week, that came out that said you are co-sponsoring, amongst many other congressional members, a bill to help save net neutrality. Yes. Tell me about this legislation.
This is very important. This is another aspect of, it's funny, the president, when he ran, he was the populist. I'm going to take on the special interests, and yet there's never been more corporate executives in key positions in the executive branch that I can think of in the history of the country. So what we really witnessed is sort of the corporate takeover of the United States government when Donald Trump was elected, all the while he was running around promising people that he was going to be, the exact opposite. But net neutrality is a great example. Big, powerful corporations want the ability to control what goes on the internet so they can charge more for it. So they can say, look, you want greater speed for your content, pay us more, we'll give it to you, and your competitors will get less. That undermines the whole premise of the internet. The internet reduced the barrier to entry. Everyone can get on and play at the same level. But if you start picking and choosing favorites amongst content, if the people who control the pipes, the things that connect the internet, I use pipes metaphorically, then you start to create a situation where you don't have that free and open situation. So this is something that the internet providers wanted, and the president's FCC gave them. I think we should reverse it. I think we should maintain net neutrality. I'm going to fight as hard as possible to do that.
Last year was an interesting one, to say the least, 2017, in our government and our nation's history, having this administration, which has been unusual to say the least. How do you see this early in 2018? What do you think's next?
It is impossible to say. Look, we've got some pretty basic problems to address. We need to pass a budget, pass appropriations bills, deal with the immigration issue. We haven't even talked in detail about how our healthcare system is being systematically destroyed by this administration. They don't have a healthcare plan. They know they hate the old healthcare plan, and they've undermined it and made it more difficult to implement. They haven't replaced it with anything. So I'm hopeful that actually as we head into this year, that we'll start working together to actually address some of these issues. Because I know there are many members of Congress from both parties who want to see that happen. And we saw that during the brief government shutdown. 20 some odd senators came together and said, let's figure this out. And they did. It wasn't ideal, but at least you're starting to have more of a bipartisan conversation to address those issues. But then I think we need to stand united against hateful and bigoted language that comes from our president to set a better example for the country so we can begin to work together instead of just throwing insults around.
It's just my final question here is about health care. Let's go back a little bit to that. You see the president trying to get rid of it. He said he wants it to fail. You see Congress, many Republican members of Congress were never for it when it was, put into an act way back during the Obama administration. Do you think they have a plan at all? If so, and if they do, what is there any hope for it, for public health care?
They don't have a plan. They do not have a plan. They've never had a plan. Their only plan is to dismantle as much of the Affordable Care Act as they can, because they refuse to acknowledge one basic fact about health care. Unless everybody is covered, it doesn't work. And that's why repealing the individual mandate is so damaging. In the insurance business, some people are going to pay more than they get back. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And if you tell all the healthy people, you don't have to buy health insurance, then the people who aren't healthy aren't going to be able to afford it. And here's the thing about that. And I've heard a lot of Republicans say, well, people who aren't healthy, it's their own fault. So this will just force them to change their behavior. And I just think of 1,000 examples. I meet with families every day with kids who have type 1 diabetes. That's their fault. What did they do wrong? They didn't eat right when they were an infant. Type 1 diabetes hits who it hits. A lot of cancers are hereditary. There's nothing you can do about it. People get in car accidents all the time that are not their fault. All kinds of things happen to you. You have a spouse or a child who develops some terrible disease. And unfortunately, in my job, I encounter them all. MS, ALS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. These diseases hit you, not because of anything you've done, but just because that's the nature of the human body. And if that happens, you're then uninsurable under their health care plan. So, we need to really understand how healthcare policy works. And all the Republicans have is they don't like the Affordable Care Act. They don't like Obamacare. They have nothing to replace it. I think we need to get to work on something to improve upon it. And I'll tell you, for my part, it has to be a universal access system. And it doesn't have to be single payer. That's one option, but a lot of the countries in Europe that have health care for everybody don't have single payer. They have multiple insurers, they have multiple providers. It's a heavily regulated system, but it doesn't have to be one thing. But if it doesn't cover everybody, we're all in the healthcare lottery. You're all hoping that you don't have a child with a terrible illness, that you don't get in an accident. I mean, I've just in the last 3 years, I've had 3 hip surgeries. My hips were impinged. It's genetics. I didn't do anything. Just eventually my hips gave out. So, I've gone through some significant healthcare challenges that I didn't anticipate. So, and people are facing that every day. So I hope we can have a discussion about healthcare policy that understands the challenges involved in it.